school's back, what you need to know for week 1. Things that I highly recommend you consider, implementing for your child's return back to school. I think they're useful. And so we're just going to briefly go over those. One of the things I recommend is considering an introductory letter. And what that consists of is really just a very brief, I like to highlight, I think this should be brief and concise and to the point, on behalf of you to the teacher or teachers, right? Like Lindsay's daughter's going to middle school. And for those of you who have high schoolers, your child may have multiple teachers, right? So, the same letter for all teachers, if there are multiple, even service providers, right? It doesn't just have to be limited to teachers, just introducing your child to their service providers and their teachers. I think this is nice to do, particularly for those kiddos who are going to be in gen ed classes and who may have multiple teachers. So they have an idea of who your child is, right? What their strengths are, number one, highlighting those strengths. So they know kind of what works for them, their learning style, how to capitalize, and also maybe some areas of need that they can be mindful of. Maybe your kid doesn't like to be put on the spot and be called on without raising their hand or initiating that experience. Maybe your child really needs to sit in the front versus in the back, or whatever those things are, keeping it, maybe bullet pointed and concise and to the point. Another thing that I think this is helpful for, that I put at the end here, is, let's be honest, particularly if your child has multiple gen ed teachers. I hate to tell you this, but maybe you're already aware they're not reading the whole IEP, right? So that's just kind of what happens. Unless it's a super awesome teacher, and there are awesome teachers that don't read IEPs, and it's just overwhelming. And oftentimes gen ed teachers don't really know what they're reading, and it's sad but true. They don't get that teaching in their credentialing program, so it's pretty tough. So providing this letter kind of holds them all accountable, because you can say, hey, I told you that this is what my child had in terms of an accommodation, and it wasn't implemented, and you can't say you didn't know, right? Either way, they should have read the IEP, but you have another layer of kind of protection there, for lack of a better word, where you can say, I also sent you this letter before the first day of school, and it's right here. So there's no excuses, right?
So let's talk about how we can ensure that our child's IEP is being followed. Some of our kids might have 3 accommodations in their IEP, and others might have 43. And so way too often kids are not getting the accommodations outlined in their IEPs, or they're not receiving them properly. Many times it's just a lack of oversight or lack of clear communication amongst the team. And other times there are sadly teachers who act like accommodations are an unfair advantage. So they don't use them, or they make the student so uncomfortable about it that the student doesn't self-advocate. So what can parents do if their children can't properly access the environment around them?
It's important to keep in mind that usually when we have accommodations in an IEP, we're not expecting every teacher to use every one of them every day, right? So usually accommodations are going to be situation specific, like in math, they're going to do something, or they're going to be based on the child's needs. Maybe a child has a need for movement breaks more on Monday than they did on Wednesday. So it's, that makes it a little bit harder, right? Because if it's an as needed, then how do you know when it was needed? So obviously the easiest way to start is if your child's able to communicate, you can ask them and talk to them, right? But I know that doesn't work for all kids. Not all kids are able to communicate. So you can look at the clues, context clues, I call them, right? Like what's coming home, what kind of, if they're bringing home any schoolwork, or now that everything's on the computer, what is their grades look like on the computer, and kind of keep an eye. If they're starting to do poorly, for example, in a class they're typically really good at, or they really enjoy, that might be a clue that they're not getting. Another one is you can, I always advocate starting from a place of cooperation and collaboration. And so I would start with the email to the teacher, ask how it's going. Maybe pick a couple of the accommodations that are most important, or at least that you think are the most helpful to your child, and ask, if they've been working and helping the child focus in class, or if they've been helping the child with their sensory needs, or whatever the point of the accommodation is, and see how the teacher responds. But you know, you want to make the tone of it very collaborative. You don't want the teacher to feel like you're coming at them in an accusatory way right off the bat.
What about samples? Because I mean, I know there's some times where it's like all the work is in the app and it's not accessible, you know, or obviously accessible to a parent. So should we be asking for work samples throughout the year? Do we wait till a progress report comes? I mean, how do you approach that?
Absolutely. If you have concerns or questions, or you're just curious, right, what your kid is doing, it's absolutely appropriate to ask for some work samples be sent home. When my oldest was in elementary school, everything was on paper. So his backpack would come home and it would be exploding with papers. I would open it and they would just be there. But I know that that's not true so much because everything's in a Google Drive. And if that's the case, you can also ask for your child's, like, for example, LAUSD, they have a Google Drive. Ask for make sure you have your child's login and password and go in their Google Drive and see what they're doing too. If applicable. That may not be applicable for kindergarten or first graders, but as they get older, that's definitely a good way to get a look. So ask the teacher. So that the answer is ask the teacher, get access to the computer system your child's using, which hopefully you already have, but if you don't, do that. And you said if progress reports, that's a good time to do it too. When you get the progress reports, ask for some of those work samples. You can ask pretty much any time, but progress reports feels like a real natural time to do it.
We would have kind of like a traveling art teacher or something coming into a class. And then I realized like nothing was being modified at all. So it was like appropriate or accessible for my daughter. So it's sort of keep all of those things in mind, like throughout the school day.
Generally, it gets harder as they get older. And what I mean by that is it's pretty easy to include anyone for kindergarten. I know that your IEP teams are saying differently, but really it's pretty easy at kindergarten because none of the kids know what they're doing, right? As they get older, it does get a little bit harder. And something that can help is when you do gain access to your older kids' computer logins for school, you can see what assignments are coming up and you can reach out to the teacher and say, you know, what's the plan for modifying this assignment? So if there's an assignment coming up that's, you know, read this book and write a 3-page whatever essay and put together a poster board presentation, right? And that's just not going to happen for your child. You can reach out and say, so what's the plan? Are you going to provide an audio book? Is there a version of the book? There's an ability to make books a different version, a lower or an easier reading version that they can print out for you or they can purchase for many of the common books that are used. Maybe instead of an essay, they'll do just the poster board. I'm, just throwing out ideas, but you can reach out to the teacher and say, oh gosh, I see this really big assignment it's going to be due in the spring. What's the plan for my child?
IEP at a glance. So I really think this is a useful tool every year for students who can benefit from it. And I really feel like, this is something that can be accommodated for most students at whatever level they're able to utilize it. So when I say IEP at a glance, I'm referencing this to be a tool for the child, for the student, not so much for the teacher or you, the parent. I think it's really helpful as early as possible for students to be mindful and aware of what their accommodations are and what their services are. So in the event those things aren't happening, they can learn to self-advocate, right? And they can speak up and say, hey, I was supposed to, get extra time for that test, or I was supposed to have my notes and I didn't get to use them, or whatever the case may be. They can also go home and tell you like, hey, I didn't get, X, Y, and Z, and you'll be aware of that. That's an excellent resource because teachers aren't going to tell you that, right? But really that self-advocacy piece and also preparing them for the future, even though your kids may be in elementary school or middle school, once they do go on to college, if that's going to be the plan for them, really what all they're going to have access to are those accommodations, and they're going to be responsible for advocating for those. So the earlier you can teach them that, the better. This doesn't mean that, the school staff isn't going to be held accountable. If your accommodations are written in such a way that they need to be offered to your child, they will continue to need to be offered to your child. If they're not written that your child has to request them, then the teacher will still have to offer them. This is just a layer, kind of like a protective layer, again, to help remind your child what they should have access to, what their services are, what their accommodations are. So if those aren't being provided, ideally they can learn to advocate for themselves. So I would recommend putting this like in the front of their binder if they're older and they have a binder. And if they don't have that yet, maybe creating a special folder for them, or, you know, whatever you think would work for them in their backpack, or even maybe taping it on their desk if they're younger and they have something, you know, just a quick glance of the few things that you think are important for them to know depending on their age. And it can be pictures, you know, like icon format if they're not reading yet. So again, it's a variety of ways that this can be presented to them. But I would keep it, you know, brief and concise. You don't want it to have, you know, too many words, because then it's not something they can glance at, right? Kind of it's common sense in the name. But the key information that your child should know and they should have access to and make sure that they're receiving is helpful.
How can parents know who is working with their child and at the prescribed frequency and duration that's directed in the IEP?
So I love communication logs. It's going to vary based on your student and what your child needs. Some examples is, it's kind of funny because I said this to someone yesterday and they were surprised. And I was like, well, actually, I'm doing this with my own son. But we have a daily piece of paper that they send home. And it reminds me of those logs that I got when my children were like in infant toddler programs, right? Where they would put what time they ate and their diaper changes. It's kind of similar to that format. They tell me what things he did that day as far as like educationally. And then there's a little section where it tells me what he did with peers and, you know, a little section on some of his health needs. And it's just a little piece of paper. Honestly, my preference though is a shared Google Doc. That's something that some families have. Other families have had success with a binder or a notebook that goes home and back and forth every day in the child's backpack, and you just go to the next page each day. So my point is that whatever is the correct communication log is what works for that team. Okay. So if you have a team and we really like to do it on Google and that will work for you, do it that way. So it's really going to be up to the team, and it's also going to be up to the level of needs. If you have a child who has dyslexia and, you know, dysgraphia, that communication log is going to need to contain different things than if you have a child who might have Down syndrome or health problems or be in diapers or something like that. So you're going to have different needs of what's communicated.
So what do parents need to know? I mean, is it too late if they didn't ask for a team meeting last year in their IEP? Can they call one if they feel like that's needed, either a team meeting or team training?
Be specific what it is you're looking for. If there is medical or safety concerns, then that would be my personal priority. If there is a seizure protocol, if there is a G-tube, a trach, anything like that, absolutely right away, make sure that every member of the team has the training. And to that end, just to go a little off on a tangent, if you have those types of things in your IEP, you always want to make sure training's included. And it shouldn't be training at the beginning of the year. It should be training anytime there is a new staff member working with the child. Because you guys know the aid at the beginning of the year is not typically the same as the aid at the end of the year, right? So just a little tangent there. But you can definitely ask them to do the trainings, and you can ask that if you can participate or sit in on the training as the parent. And schools, they might push back because they're not used to the request, right? But it's not a request that is that far out there because you're an equal member of the team. And if you guys are talking about, for example, a behavior plan, it doesn't help the school if you do something different at home, right? Everybody has to be on the same page.
What are some questions that we need to be asking to gauge if our kids are interacting with their peers, which is as important, to many of us is as important as whatever they're learning in class, and might be, as challenging or more challenging for some kids.
This is one of those things that gets harder as they get older. Also, socialization. The younger the kids are, the less likely they are to notice differences, right? So you can ask questions of the team or, the teacher. Who do they eat lunch with, right? Are they eating lunch by themselves? Who do they eat lunch with? If your child is a child that spends part of their day in one classroom and part of their day in another classroom, like they might have art and PE and gen ed and math and English in a special day class, it becomes a little bit harder because the child is part of two communities part-time instead of one community full-time, right? So asking the questions, at PE, is the child being paired up when the other kids are paired up? Who are they being paired up with? One thing that I have found really helpful is asking the teacher if there's anybody in the classroom that your child seems to have a connection with. Is there somebody that your child gravitates towards, and that child gravitates towards your child, that friend? And asking that teacher to please reach out to that other child's parent and give them your email or whatnot, so you can try and get them together after school. Now, obviously, that scenario is for children that aren't able to communicate and say, today I played with Sally, right? Ask the teacher to be that legwork, to reach out to that other parent for you, and hopefully that other parent can reach out to you. But asking those questions, who do they sit with at lunch? And ask how is that going, right? Is there, is the child sitting during free time, whatever free time that is? Is your child off by themselves, or are they included? And if they're not being included, what can the school do to help facilitate that inclusion?
What about some of our kids if they're getting bullied? What can we do?
There's a few points about bullying. First off, if your child is being bullied, they're not safe, period. Even if you believe they're physically safe, they're not emotionally safe. And you have to figure out how to get a stop to it immediately. So there's a few steps that I would do. I'd first call for an IEP meeting. There is actually no such thing as an emergency IEP meeting. The school has 30 days to hold the meeting no matter what. But I would ask the school to move up the meeting if at all possible, because you don't want to wait. Another thing that you can do is ask for a meeting with the vice principal and the teacher, or the assistant principal, I guess we call it now, and the teacher. Just a parent-teacher conference, not an IEP, to talk about it. And I would be looking for immediate reaction. I want immediate change. I don't want, we're going to investigate and get back to you in a few weeks. If they want to go investigate and get back to me tomorrow, okay, that's reasonable, right? But I don't want to wait for whatever they're going to do. I want to know that the child that is making my child feel unsafe, and note how I said that. I didn't say the child that's bullying my child. I said the child that's making my child feel unsafe. The reason I phrase it that way is because you can only focus on your kid, and you can't control what's going on with the other kid. You can only control what's going on with your kid. So the goal is to get your kid away from the other kid. And then there is a letter, Gebser. I always want to say GER, but it's Geb. It's GEBSER, letter. I think that we're going to have an article coming out soon about that. But this is a letter that basically puts the school on notice that there is a bullying incident going on. And when a child is being bullied and the child who's being bullied has an IEP, the school has an elevated responsibility to protect the child with the IEP. So this letter puts the school on notice that it's happening, because we don't want the school to say they didn't know it was happening down the road when you're trying to get it fixed. So it's an important letter to formally give notice that you have these concerns. And I would not be patient. I tell a lot of my parents, give the school a few days, be patient. I would not be patient. Your child, if they're being bullied, is not safe. The school needs to come up with an immediate plan to keep your child safe the very next day, right? I'm presuming this meeting's after school. They need a plan by the next morning of who is going to make sure your child is safe.
For checking in, like for health plan, making sure that's in place. What do parents need to know about those?
A health plan for most districts, okay, so different districts do it differently, but it's really a section in the IEP that says what you do when something happens. So it might be where it's often the nurse section where the nurse wrote, staff to be trained in how to administer an EpiPen, what to do if there's a seizure, what to do if a G-tube's pulled out, whatever. And that is the health plan, right? And I talk about that because for a lot of districts, it's just kind of buried in the areas of need or the present level area of need section. And you want to make sure that that's brought to the attention of everyone working with the child, because a lot of times, most of the time, you can't predict those events. When is a child going to need an EpiPen? You can't predict that that's only going to happen when the child's in the classroom, and the speech therapist will never need it. Right. So that's something that if you do an all about me document or have an IEP summary that you present to your team, like at the beginning of the year, that's definitely something you want to highlight and include.
Is there anything else that you want to say about emergency plans, which some people don't really know what that means? It might be good for you to highlight.
So an IEP is really a document, right, that is individualized. So just because there's not a section in the document to put something doesn't mean that it shouldn't be in there. So most teams are willing to put together an emergency plan, which can be just a paragraph that you attach somewhere in the IEP in the notes, or an attachment that says what will happen for your child if there is an emergency. So a fire, if your child has mobility issues and they're attending school on the second floor and the building catches fire, who's going to take your child out? Because that teacher, if that child's in gen ed, or they could potentially have in high school 35, 40 kids in the room, and the teacher's got to get all those kids out. So whose job is it to physically pick up your child and carry him down the stairs? Mm-hmm. If your child has issues with sounds, it can include things about how to manage drills. For example, maybe putting the child's headphones on his desk and warning him beforehand, we're about to have a fire drill. If you need your headphones, here they are. Because part of keeping your child safe is teaching them what to do.
And the final essential that I recommend is just really writing into your child's IEP, ongoing progress monitoring. So, by law, depending on whether your district does like a quarter system or a trimester, that's only 3 or 4 check-ins throughout the year, right? Because you would get one at every reporting period that gen ed students would get. So it's either the tri or the quarters. That's not really that much. And so given, again, the state of kind of what we're coming back to, where we're coming from, again, if your kid has been out of school for the whole over a year, you're probably going to want to know how they're reacclimating and just what things are looking like. So write this into their IEP, regular ongoing progress monitoring. You can have like monthly team meetings where you meet with, the case manager and the service providers, or, whoever you want to meet with, who you think is important, even the one-to-one aide. If your child has a one-to-one aide, they're really important. Where you're just meeting to have a discussion and they're showing you some data and you're talking about it and figuring out how to, if things are going good, great, keep it status quo. If not, what can we do to fix it? You don't want to wait 3 months every single time, or however long that is, to find that information out, right? Because legally they're only required to tell you at those times. So I really recommend considering this for this year in particular, to just keep tabs on your child. And even if it's like a weekly summary that you're getting, and it's not as official as, having like all this perfect data, but at least you're having those discussions, whatever works for you, whatever you're comfortable with. But you can absolutely have that written in, the accommodation section, and have it really clear what you want it to look like. Worst case, if your district is being super, frustrating about it and they're not wanting to add that in, then just keep calling an IEP, because by law, you have that right to call an IEP, and then they have to hold it within 30 days. So pretty much you'd be getting a team meeting every 30 days, right? So, you don't want to have to go about it that way, because again, then you're setting the tone for, they're going to have their judgments and like, oh, another IEP meeting. But if they're not willing to work with you, and, it's something that is really critical for you to have that information to ensure, how your child's performing, then follow your parents' rights and call that meeting and have it every 30 days. And they cannot excuse anyone from that meeting without your consent. So you can make sure that the key players are in attendance at that meeting.